Bill Bowie, great to have you back, sir. Looking forward to discussing this next theme on the future of ethics and corporate sustainability in retail. First, if you could, Bill, just a couple sentences on yourself, and then let's talk about your panel and get into the theme.
As you know, I'm a co-founder of Convetted, and mostly in terms of building out the facilitation practice. So I have a ton of experience doing this, and then also in retail and sustainability. I was the main author of the first Walmart sustainability report. That's where I started my credentials about a decade ago. We've got some great participants, been quite active. In particular, I'll tell you in a moment about the top three, but the next up are Lise Lauren has been consistently productive throughout. She's the CEO of Earthshift. In this particular session, David Feidner was quite active, and Maria Leo proposed one of the key takeaway findings here. So we've got good diversity on the panel. The first theme was really about the upstream production, and then we focused on the environmental impact. So it was really time to open up and look at the social side of things. In particular, looking at the intersection between retail and community, sort of looking at the core of the retail experience for customers, consumers, and the communities that they operate in.
And in this theme, you had some shining stars worth mentioning.
Joss is always a deep thinker who melds that with very hands-on experience. So he was key to one of the key takeaways in this theme. Bruce is really on the corporate side, so gave an in-depth perspective of what it looks like from a core business setting. And then Bill Roth has been a stellar performer throughout this entire engagement. He has a way of catching the big picture and seeing the trends that are really coming to the fore while also having in-depth hands-on experience. So what I found most interesting about this particular one is that, social impact is often viewed through the split lens of social benefits on the one side versus social costs on the other. And so what was interesting to me about this theme is that it flipped this perspective around in terms of looking at how social impacts can be transformed into benefits. So that was particularly interesting to me, as well as how wide-ranging the conversation was, looking at kind of systemic impacts on the one hand, and then delving into, on the other hand, sort of the customer and their obsession, sort of looking through the Jeff Bezos lens and seeing how that obsession can drive unsustainability, but by the same token, again, can that be flipped to where that drive for customer satisfaction can be leveraged for sustainability. The first key point that I really highlighted here is from Joss Tantrum. He proposed a shift in focus from social impact to social utility. And so he was looking at it really at this kind of alignment between self-interest on the one hand and common interest on the other hand. So what Joss had to say was questioning whether companies should be more interested in their social utility, kind of asking the question, is the world a better place because we exist? And what he said was that without this kind of change in markets and financial norms, that we're really not going to be able to make the transformative change to sustainability for companies across the board. The second key takeaway really comes out of a question that I posed as a facilitator around the question of bias or unconscious bias in particular. And this stemmed from the recent episode with a couple of African-American gentlemen hanging out in a Starbucks waiting for a meeting and, not ordering a drink until their meeting compatriot arrived. And in the meanwhile, the police were called and they were arrested. And the upshot of this was that Starbucks is doing a training for all of their workers in the U.S. on this question of unconscious bias. Bill really picked up on this and pointed out that bias has real hardcore business relevance now. And he said that it's essentially an economic distortion and a form of inefficiency. It really needs to be handled by the CFO, who would quantify and report on this, how this bias impacts on revenues, costs, and risks. Until this is the case, bias is just going to be ineffectively managed by the business. In particular, he found bias in terms of race, religion, and sexual orientation generating the following costs: ineffectual business decision distortion that damages profits, brand devaluation measured by customer and revenue loss, supply chain distortions measured by reduced quality control and increased costs, and then finally legal and PR costs. So this was a particularly interesting one to me. Point number 3, Maria Leo, one of our really productive contributors, proposed that ethical and sustainable retailers really are those who are including social responsibility in their mission statements and their business models. So it's essentially embedded into their DNA. David Feigner chimed in on this very succinctly, saying that when it comes to corporate responsibility, if you're giving back, then you took too much. And I think that really sort of succinctly summarizes the distinction that we're making here between, companies who have questionable ethics embedded in their business model that they then need to compensate for example, through corporate philanthropy, as compared to companies that just plain have that ethical and sustainable structure. So throughout this engagement, and in particular this theme, we've continued to come back to the question of disruptive technologies, and in this instance, particularly artificial intelligence, and the proposal that AI can really start to track consumer and customer sentiment and then automatically roll that into supply chain criteria. Of course, this was proposed by Bill Roth, but Bruce Clafter chimed in with the question of benefits of AI are in the eye of the beholder, if you will, are in the ethics of the use of AI. So he put out a sort of a cautionary note here that AI could be used for good or ill, and he suspects, in fact, that it's going to be net negative to begin with. So this really gives an example of the kind of nuance of this particular discovery board.
So, Bill, it sounds like any one of these key points could be a panel in its own right, but just sort of pulling our heads back up to where the panel is overall, we have this slide view of your priority map.
I think that what we're seeing in this particular discovery board is that it's merging the ethical case with the business case. So as the board progresses, we're seeing more and more where the sentiment is moving towards there being a strong business case for the ethical and sustainable practice, which really cuts against the traditional, I would say, misperception, but the traditional idea that it essentially is a cost to implement ethical practices or sustainable practices. And so what we're seeing increasingly is that this is not antithetical to one another. These are really harmonized. So, for example, looking at that price-cost gap or the profit before people or the business case for ethical retail, each of these is less and less seen as an obstacle. Our next leap is into the political implications, in particular looking at the benefits of brands taking stands, if you will. What are the benefits and the risks of brands taking specific political stances, in particular, the degree to which those stances align with ethical underpinnings.
Bill, great to reconnect. Great hearing about your progress. Look forward to talking in a few weeks.
Sounds great, Tom. Thank you for checking in.